Many of us are familiar with the episode in Sefer Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, when Moshe Rabbeinu is told by Hashem that he can't go and lead the people into the land of Israel because of some error that he makes at this moment where for the second time the people are thirsty for water and Moshe helps them get water from a rock. And the classic or first level kind of description of what's supposed to be the problem there is that whereas the first time there's a rock and Hashem told Moshe to strike the rock with his staff and then water came out, the second time he told Moshe to speak to the rock, but Moshe struck the rock, and so he wasn't careful enough in the way that he heeded Hashem's command. And so Hashem says to him, Kasher, well, this is a repetition, but the word lehakadisheni repeats twice, but it's kasher miritem pi b'midbar tzin b'merivat ha'ira lehakadisheni v'mayim le'enehem hem me merivat kadesh midbar tzin. For you rebelled against my commandment in the desert of Tzin, in the strife of the congregation to sanctify me at the water before their eyes. That is the water of Merivah and Kadesh in the wilderness of Tzin. And the first lehakadisheni is ויאמר אדוני אל משה ואל אהרון יען לא האמנתם בי להקדישני לעיני בני ישראל לכן לא תביאו את הקהל הזה אל הארץ אשר נתתי להם. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and said, because you did not trust in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the people before Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given to them. So there's some failure in what Moshe and Aaron did. And people make different things out of this. There's more than one point to make here. But I think what I want to focus on for today is the puzzle presented by this word, lehakadisheni. Because usually this is translated as, you did not sanctify me in the eyes of the people. And we treat that as just sort of a generality. Like Hashem is very kadosh, he's the most kadosh, that there's some kind of improper honor that was given to Hashem by not listening to him properly, but really the problem was not listening to him properly. You know, he was told to speak to the rock, and he struck the rock, right? But that would even make a little bit more sense if the conjugation of the verb were different, but it's lehakdisheni. And the makdish version of this verb, which has to do with Kiddusha, holiness, special, separate, and differentness. The Makdish version, that's saying not just that something is holy or is made holy, but it's specifically referring to the idea that it's been separated and set aside. Okay, so we see lots of different uses of this conjugation of the verb in very practical terms having to do with the temple and dedicating things to the temple. For example, if you just look for the word hikdish in Sefer Shmuel, it says Gam otam hikdish hamelech David laAdonai im hakesef ve'azahav asher hikdish mikol hagoyim asher kibesh, which also King David consecrated to the Lord, which is the silver and gold that he had consecrated from all the nations which he had conquered. The consecration, like you have property you've seized in war, and you're going to somehow dedicate it to Hashem and to his temple, or some kind of setting aside in which it's going to plug into that system. It's hekdesh is a halachic term that we're in general using for those kinds of things. And if we look, for the word also in the Torah itself, hikdashti first appears ki li kol bechor biyom hakoti chol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim hikdashti li chol bechor b'Yisrael me'adam ad behema li yihyu ani Adonai. Because all the firstborn are mine, for on the day that I struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I consecrated to me all the firstborn in Israel, both man and beast, mine shall they be, I am the Lord. And so in practice, that means different things, right? Like, first of all, it means that there has to be this kind of exchange that is explicit in the Torah, where the Levim become the tribe that has to serve Hashem in a special way, but that is in a sense a replacement of the Bechor, of the firstborn of Israel, because initially they had been set aside for that purpose. Or that when, it refers here to, in the pasuk we just read, to animals. So if you have a firstborn donkey or a firstborn sheep, you can't shear the firstborn sheep, or you can't plow with the firstborn donkey, that there's a kind of a setting aside of this thing for a special and different and separate purpose that is not going to make it acceptable for normal use, right? And so I think that Lehakadishenit, with Hashem talking about himself, the puzzle that's presented there is, can we read into that HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying, you did not properly set me aside for a special purpose? Like, what does that mean in that context? So that, I think, is the puzzle we want to raise first and foremost, is what in that passage is different about what happened before. The first time, we focus usually on the striking the rock twice, but we'll return to that issue. But not just, striking the rock twice or once, but what is it that Moshe might have done, or Moshe and Aaron did wrong second time, that failed to set HaKadosh Baruch Hu aside as though for use for a special purpose in the way of this Makdish conjugation of this root of Kodesh, which obviously is everywhere in that passage. They're in a place called Kadesh, and it ends with Vayikadesh Bam, that somehow Hashem made something holy through presumably the waters, is the Bam in that's being referred to. Or maybe Bnei Israel, one could return to that question. But so once you start asking this, because it doesn't really have an obvious answer, another thing to notice is that the rock is referred to by a different word in the second story. So in the first story, the first time there is this striking of water from a rock, the people come, they say to Moshe that they're thirsty, and they are, worried that they're going to die in the desert. And Moshe says to Hashem, these people are going to stone me. And Hashem says, so it's Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Avor lifnei ha'am, v'kach itcha meziknei Yisrael, umatcha asher hikita bo et hayaor, kach biyadcha u'halachta. Hineni omed lifanecha sham al hatzur, behorev u'hikita בצור ויצאו ממנו מים ושתה העם ויעש כן משה לעיני זקני ישראל. Okay, so the Lord said to Moses, go before the people, take with you the elders of Israel and your rod with which you struck the river, and take it in your hand and go. Behold, I will stand before you there upon the rock. The tzur, the rock is referred to as a tzur there. And it's not just the tzor, but it's bichorev. I will stand before you on the rock in Chorev. The tzor in Chorev, since we know Chorev is Har Sinai, sounds a lot like Har Sinai essentially. Nikrat tzor, the cleft of the rock, where Moshe will be placed by Hashem, and Hashem will show his ways. So it's very associated with this place of revelation. And you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So that's the first time. It's called a tzor. But when we go to the second episode, right, where Moshe is going to get in trouble or do the wrong thing, in Sefer Bamidbar, there's a different buildup, because the people complain, but they complain in ways that are different in their details, and we can talk about that in a second. But when it comes to the point where there is this rock to have water struck from it, seemingly, so it says, "V'yidaber Adonai Moshe lemor, kach et hamate, v'haqhel et ha'eda, ata ve'Aharon ahicha, v'dibartem el hasela la'ineihem, v'natan meimar, v'hotzeta lahem maim min hasela, v'ishkita et ha'eda ve'et be'iram." So the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod and gather the assembly together, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth its water, and you shall bring forth to them water out of the rock. So you shall give the congregation and their beasts to drink." Now, I think there's a lot you could question in this translation, which we'll raise in due course. But the main thing I want to point out to start with is the word here is not tzur, the word is selah. So why is it selah in one case, and why is it tzor in another case? What is the difference between a tzor and a selah? These are both words for rock, but the Torah wouldn't make that change lightly. So practically speaking, you might wonder if there's some relevant difference between those two words that is actually a key detail that could tell you something about the difference of the situation. And maybe that will help explain why Hashem was not properly set aside for appropriate use, if we're reading that into this Makdish conjugation of the verb before. So you could start to try to tease this out carefully in different ways. But I'll just lay the thesis on the table, and then we can see some evidence for it. I think the main difference I want to claim between Selah on the one hand and Tzor on the other hand is that Tzor is a rock. In Chorev it's described, and Chorev actually means dry. Charava is dry, or dryness. And there's no sense in which water should be found in a tzor, right? In fact, later the Torah refers to a tzor as like chalamish tzor, like a flint, something you might strike fire from. And that's even evoked by a pasuk in Parshat Ha'azinu, shemen mechalamish tzor, like shemen is for lighting fire, it's oil, and chalamish tzor is like a flinty rock for striking a fire. Selah, on the other hand, is, I want to claim, a rock that already has water flowing through it, which will sound strange because it seems like the whole point is that people were saying we don't have water, and there needs to be a miracle where water gets supplied by Moshe striking water from the rock. That's not, I think, what has to be happening here. I think an alternative scenario is either this is the same rock they were at before, which would be fair since both places are called Meriva, or if it's not the same rock, it's a rock that may as well be the same rock in the sense that as they had started getting water come out of it before, now there's still water coming out of it. And think about just how much that would change the situation if that were true, first of all. And second of all, can the text actually support such a scenario? Because if the people are complaining they don't have water, then how could it be that a selah is a rock that already has water coming out of it? Because then what are they complaining about? They already have water. So what is the driving force behind this whole episode? So the way that you can make this hang together is if you notice what Bnei Israel are saying right before the second episode with the selah. What are they actually saying to Moshe? They are not just complaining they don't have water. They say, much more artfully and beautifully, "V'lama hevetem et kahal Adonai el hamidbar hazeh lamut sham anachnu uve'irenu." Why have you brought us, this congregation of the Lord, into the wilderness so that we can, with our cattle, die here? "V'lama he'ritunu b'mitzrayim lehavi otanu el hamakom hara hazeh lo makom zera uteina ugefen urimon umayim ayin lishtot." And why have you made us come out of Egypt? To bring us to this bad place, this place of no seed or figs or vines or pomegranates, where there's no water to drink. Now, those are some pretty specific details. They're not just saying there's no water. They happen to be saying, there's no figs or grapes or pomegranates because there's no water. Now, that's very interesting because this is 40 years after the sin of the spies, right? The spies went into the land, they scouted the land, and they brought back fruits of the land. And what did they bring back? They brought back teina, gefen, and rimon. They brought back figs and grapes and pomegranates. So this is the cultural memory of the generation that came after that. And they're really saying, why aren't we in the promised land, right? That's where we want to be. That's where there's sweet fruits that grow from the water there. So they're not just saying we want water. They're saying we want a land with sweet fruits that grow from the water there. And that, I think, is the key thing to pick up on here, because once we realize that, this is not necessarily just about water. This is a more specific kind of quibble. And in fact, once you start to think about it, you say, has there been another time where people have, or the people, where Bnei Israel have been saying they didn't have any water, and then there was this mention of sweetness associated with the water here? These are all sweet fruits that we're talking about, and not just sweetness, but also a plant like a tree, maybe, that somehow was associated with the sweetness at the time when people were saying there was water that they couldn't drink. And what you realize is this is referring, I don't want to say more so than to the moment where Moshe strikes the water from the rock for the first time, but maybe even as much, not to that event, but to the earlier event, the first time that Bnei Israel complained about water, which is actually not at the time where they get water from a rock. After Kriyat Yam Suf, the first thing that happens is Vayavo Marata velo yachlu lishtot mayim mimara ki marim hem al ken kara shema Mara. And when they came to Mara, they could not drink the waters of Mara, for they were bitter. Therefore, its name was called Mara. And so they complained to Moshe. Vayalinu ha'am al Moshe le'mor ma nishteh. And the people murmured against Moshe, saying, what are we going to drink? Vayitz'ak el Adonai vayorehu Adonai etz vayishlech el hamayim vayimteku hamayim sham sam lo hok umishpat v'sham nisahu. And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree, which he then threw onto the waters, and it made the waters sweet. And there he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he tested them. Okay, so the event that's taking place here is the first time the people are complaining they don't have water. The solution is not getting water from a rock. They have water, it's just water they can't drink because they say it's bitter. It's marim hem, right? Bitter waters. And the solution is somehow involves a tree and sweetness that makes the water drinkable. Then later, after the man, after they get their magical food or their miraculous food, then they want miraculous water as well. And so they get this water from a rock. And that's from the Tzur in Chorev, right? So it's very associated with the upcoming revelation at Sinai. Interestingly, also, right after this event, there's at first a seemingly unrelated event where it's, and then they came on, they went, Vayavo Elima, V'sham shtei ma'asrei ainot ma'im, V'shiva'im tamarim, V'yahanu sham al hamayim. And they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped there by the waters. Now, I already think that you could say, well, maybe that's just a retelling of the same story, right? They come to some water, there are 12 wells of water, and they say, this is bitter water, we can't drink it. Why is Hashem tormenting us in this way? And then they realize there are a bunch of palm trees that produce sweet dates that are growing there. These are tamarim, so they're date palms that are growing on the water. And maybe they can't drink the water, but who cares if you get sweet, juicy dates from the tree that you can eat and that you can get some moisture from, right? So that in a sense could be a naturalistic description of something a little bit more revelatory where Hashem teaches them some way. But even the way that Hashem is teaching them, throwing a tree on the water to make it sweet, it still sounds almost more sort of like a technical solution within the world and how it works. But in any case, these are almost the same thing. It's sort of compressed retelling. It's saying, look, the people, they don't have any water to drink. They think it's bitter and it's like a punishment to them. And then they realize that it's actually a gift to them from Hashem, who made sweet trees for them to eat. And the people simply cannot live that way. They can't trust in Hashem enough to say, okay, and maybe tomorrow there'll be some otherness, some other way that Hashem takes care of us And it will at first seem like it's not going to work out, and then it will work out, and we just need to trust in him. Then the next thing that happens is that they basically say, no, we want food from the sky so that you'll feed us so we don't starve to death. And we want water from a rock so that we just have a regular, miraculous mechanism for getting what we need every day. But the point is this. So there was this early event where HaKadosh Baruch Hu made bitter waters sweet for them, and that was the way that he saved them and helped them. The moment here, when we go now back to Sefer Bamidbar with the Rimon and the Geffen, whatever, the people are complaining. They're both saying we want to go to Eretz Yisrael, and they're also complaining in this way where this is really about a bitter water situation where they're saying there's no water for us to drink. Not that there's no water. There's no water that we can drink, and we feel so bitter about that. And that's being referred to by the fact that they're talking about these sweet fruiting trees or plants, so to speak, that are going to be there in Eretz Yisrael for them, but which also may kind of refer to the possible solution here, right? That this is a situation where they may not realize the way that this water can be useful to them. And I think that you could hear all of this and think, okay, maybe, but you don't really know that the word selah means that, right? And that's true. It's maybe a bit cobbled together in the background of the text in the Chumash itself, but I happen to think that Yeshayahu Navi agrees with this reading. Because if you go to Yeshayahu, there is a pasuk where it's talking about, excoriating idolaters of various kinds, as he's often wont to do. And we have this pasuk in Perek Nun Zayin, Perek Hey. Hanehamim ba'ilim tahat kol etz ra'anan shochtei hayeladim b'nehalim tahat se'ifei hasla'im. Okay. Burning with lust among the terebinths, under every green tree, slaying their children in the valleys, under the clefts of the rocks. Okay, so in this passage, it's referring to idolatry and child sacrifice. And there's a repeated phrase among the Nevi'im that all these idolaters in Canaan, they want to sacrifice their children under an etz ra'anan, like a flourishing tree, right? A tree that has water and therefore is flourishing, because that was a kind of idolatry that the Canaan believed in. And he uses the word sala'im to refer to the clefts of these particular rocks, which are what? Banehalim, in the Nahal, in the Wadi, in the little valley with water running through it. It also refers to the Etz Ra'anan, which in itself is a sign of water. But even the most amazing thing is there's reference to terebinths. The terebinth is Elah, but the plural of terebinths used here is Elim. So Ba'ilim tahat kol Etz Ra'anan, right? Elim is the place where we had the date palms and the springs of water, right? Right after sweetening of the waters, right? So at the moment where Yeshayahu is using the word Elim to talk about a plural of the Elah, which is this tree that probably grows in the valleys where the water is running down. David fights Goliath in Emek HaElah, and so that's a place where you have a valley, the valley of Elah, the valley of the terebinth, where water is going to run down and the terebinth can grow. So if the terebinth needs water to grow in a valley, that's where we have Nehalim tahat se'ifei hasla'im. So the sla'im are like the rocks up above the valley, let's say, where the water is going to run down into the valley because it's coming out of these mountain springs in the rocks on the side of the mountain. So the Selah is identified there as a rock associated with water flow in the crags of the valleys of Eretz Yisrael or Eretz Canaan. So that is the key thing to pick up on, right? There already is an association of the Selah meaning the rock that might have water in it, with this term elim that we have with the sweet waters. So I really think, from this passage, you could say Yeshayahu is aware of this thing going on with the moments where the water is being struck from the rock. And he sees the connection to the sweet tree that sweetens the bitter waters. And what pulls it together then is to say, if the Selah has water coming out of it, then it makes sense as a bitter water situation. And isn't it interesting, therefore, that Moshe, when he's talking to Bnei Israel and he's kind of rebuking them while getting the water from the Selah, it says, "Vayakilu Moshe ve'Aaron et ha'kahal el pnei haSelah, vayomer lahem shi'u na hamurim hamin haSelah hazeh notzi lachem mayim." And Moshe and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and he said to them, "Here now, you rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock?" So it's talking about the Selah, right? And then it says, "Vayireh Moshe et yado vayach et haSelah b'mateu pa'amayim vayetzu mayim rabim vashtesh ta'ida uve'iram." And Moshe lifted up his hand, and with his rod he struck the rock twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. But look, the word for rebels that Moshe uses is morim, which is the same word as marim for bitter, right? So the same word that we had for the bitter waters before, now in associating with the rebellion of the people here, we have mem, resh, yud, mem. It's just different vowels. So this really is referring to the idea of bitter waters, just as we had before the tree made it sweet. And we started this story off with people complaining that there were no sweet trees, and that's the kind of water problem that they had. So this is, I think, a situation where there was water, there was a Selah, and the people weren't happy with it. And the way they weren't happy with the bitter waters when they first came out of Kriyat Yamsuf, it just felt too difficult to them. The water was a temptation, but it was tantalizingly beyond reach somehow. It didn't seem drinkable, and they just said, what is HaKadosh Baruch Hu doing to us, making these problems for us? And here the same kind of spirit is reigning, where the people are complaining, even though they have a spring with water coming out of it, because who knows, the water is somehow unacceptable to them. And the last thing we have to deal with is, but then Moshe strikes the rock. Why is he striking the rock? And I think there, and also, one of the things you have to deal with is grammar in the Torah is always deliberately open to multiple interpretations and is ambiguous. So this thing with the sequence of events where he lifts his hand and he strikes the rock, and then it tells you that he struck the rock twice. Did he strike the rock twice at this moment? Or is this the second time he's striking a rock, right? It's like saying this is the second rock striking event where water comes out. Because there's no, past tense, present perfect, whatever. There's just vayach, he struck the rock, bimateo pa'amayim. But is it possible that either this is the same rock, or if you don't want to say it's the same rock, that the Torah is evoking the same rock and saying, look, this may as well be the same rock. It was a tzur before he struck it, water was coming out. Now 40 years later, they're back at that rock, and they're like, this isn't acceptable somehow. I don't like the water. And I know there's a midrash about carrying around the stone of Miriam, and it's like they had this well that they carried with them that was the rock that always gave them water. But when Chazal say things like that, they're not saying, okay, so sweep away all other problems of the text that you encounter. It's usually a hint at how to resolve those problems one way. But I don't think we have to deal with that midrash in order to make sense of this. So the proposal I'd be making is more that when he says he struck it twice, it doesn't mean he struck it twice at this moment. And then it says immediately afterwards, Vayetzu mayim rabim. But again, and lots of water came out. There's no distinction between that and lots of water was coming out, right? Like at the time that he struck it, lots of water was coming out already. That also, I think, you could get from the text here. So then why does Moshe strike the rock? He might be striking the rock because the people say the water is not acceptable, and he's like looking for okay, let's sweeten the water. Let's strike the rock not to make water, but to sweeten the water. And that, I think, is getting us back to the original question of Le'akadisheni. What is the problem with what Moshe does as far as not setting Hashem aside for the appropriate purpose? What does that mean here in this context? And I think you can make more out of this, and I think there might be another shiur in the making here, because this is also connected with the fiery serpents and other things that happen the first time when the water is made sweet by the tree. And so we can maybe dig more out of this going forward, but I think the basic point right now is just this. If it's the case that there is water coming out of the rock, then this is more like a situation, like the kind of technical solution to begin with, where there was a tree you could mix with the water and it would make it sweet. Or maybe even also we can notice, this place is called Merivah. The first time the word Merivah appears in the Torah, it's this dispute between Lot and Avram. They can't share the land. Lot goes somewhere where there's water all the time in Stone. It's presumably because their shepherds can't share water with each other. So there's this sense of this being maybe about not there isn't water, but maybe there's not enough water. Maybe the water was bitter because there wasn't enough. Notice, like they say, and also our cattle, right? Like that, they want enough water for every one of their concerns, and they want it all to be addressed. And if it feels insufficient, then there's a bitterness maybe that's associated with it, or it makes them rebellious, or it makes them complain. But the point is that these people have been in the desert for 40 years. They have been learning from their experience to depend on HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to depend on Moshe's guidance about how to behave so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives them the nest that they need and that sustains them for another day. That's been their modus operandi. And now Moshe's failure is what? The people came to him saying, after 40 years, right? They came to him saying, this water isn't good enough. Something about this situation that we have is unacceptable. It needs a solution. And the language that they use was the language from the sin of the spies. It was the fruits that the spies brought back. In other words, they're pining for the land of Israel. They're saying, why aren't we in the land of Israel? Can we go to the land of Israel? Maybe they don't say that explicitly, but in what they're saying, Moshe should be able to hear, this is the time, right? The right thing is to say to these people, okay, we don't need this water to sustain us forever because we're on the border of the land of Israel. We're going in now. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was giving Moshe the chance to recognize that the people had changed, that now their complaint was, we're not in the land of Israel yet. And if he had spoken to the rock, he could have given a speech about the water and said, look, take heart. I'll talk to you about this rock here. There's some water coming out of it. It's not enough for us. We're going to die if we stay here, but we have a little bit for now. And now we're going to march into the land where there are Rimonim and Te'anim and Geffen, and there's going to be water there. The time has come. But he misses that opportunity. And instead, what he does is he said, okay, what's my job? Well, for the last 40 years, my job has been to sustain these people with miraculous occurrences. And because obviously living in the Midbar doesn't make sense, otherwise it can't be done, with a nation of this size and of this sort of diversity of needs. There's no way that would work, but it has worked. And the way I continue to make it work is I take out my mate and I deliver people from Paro with the splitting of the sea, and I deliver people from dehydration by hitting rocks and making the water plentiful enough or better or whatever it is. And so Moshe is still in this mindset of, my job is to sustain these people in the Midbar. And he fails to recognize that time has come to a close. And I think the point is, it's not just like, he failed to answer the last question in the trivia quiz correctly. It's that it reflects something about who he is, what his approach to leadership is, that shows that he's inappropriate to lead the people into the land, right? That he can't get his mind into a frame that says, there's a problem with living here. Like, obviously Moshe knows that he's taking the people to the land, but at another level, his purpose and his function are suited to the Midbar. And he's not perhaps sufficiently disposed to thinking, we have to get out of this place because this isn't really the place and the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to exist. There are deficiencies associated with it, right? That when HaKadosh Baruch Hu sustains you with a nes, it's not in a way necessarily that makes you feel like this is even better than real life. It's just, you're hanging on by your fingernails in a situation where you should be dead. And so he's sustaining you with a nes, but what you really like is to be over in the real world where you have pomegranates to eat, and not miraculously drinking water from a rock that no one expected to give water. So I think in terms of a lesson for the present day, you could say maybe it's a little difficult, because if Moshe's failure, or Moshe and Aaron's failure, was to not hold Hashem, so to speak, in reserve and say, no, Nisim from Hashem are for a special purpose, and they're not actually the solution all the time. And we really don't want to have this be the norm, but rather we wanted to have it be set aside for a separate, special purpose, a special separate use. That's how we want to treat Hashem's niflaot, Hashem's wonders. That if their mistake was not doing that, in a sense, they represent one extreme, and a problematic extreme, in what you might imagine as a possibility in Judaic leadership. You could imagine a leader who just says, look, it's all up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All we need is to have emunah and perfect praxis in our keeping of his Torah, and everything will be fine, right? Like, you go to Jericho, the walls fall down, you get stuck next to the sea splits and you go through. Whatever it is throughout Jewish history, we can rely on Hashem. We don't need to do anything else. Obviously, to a certain degree, that's going to engender a danger of a certain kind of laziness, right? Because if you start believing that too much, then you start leaning very heavily on, all right, so if there are armies all around me closing in and they're going to threaten to chop us to pieces, we don't need swords and we don't need weapons and we don't need to fight. We can just raise our level of kashrut to another pinnacle, and Hashem will see what faith we have and what good shomrei mitzvot we are, and meteorites will fly from the sky and destroy all our enemies, right? There's a bit of fantasy that that's how the world works. But that's not really how the world works. That's not how HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants his people to live, right? He wants us to live in our land, and he wants our land to be a place where we don't depend every day on something seemingly miraculous happening because Moshe is right there with his mateh. Instead, he wants us to depend on rain, which is part of nature, right? It's part of the nature that Hashem created and that Hashem controls and that Hashem can speak to us through, but it's still a part of the fabric of a normal reality that we can relate to and even kind of be thoughtful about and solve problems in and figure things out. So the extreme of Moshe, it's maybe kind of obvious why that doesn't fit inside Eretz Yisrael, because I think sometimes we forget that it's not an accident that the miraculous survival of Bnei Yisrael in the desert was kind of a miserable time, right? That if HaKadosh Baruch Hu is sustaining you with his niflaot, it may be that you feel his closeness and you feel tremendous ability to trust in his might and his supremacy over nature, but he doesn't want you to get too comfortable with that, and so he kind of makes it a bit of a difficult situation, which certainly was the case in the Midbar. And he wants you to start thinking, like Bnei Yisrael do, that actually there's something better than this, which is living real life in the land he gave us, where our existence is not this kind of space capsule terror show with miraculous deliverance all the time, but instead is, not in the Apollo 13 situation, but more in like down on earth, doing things the way they're normally supposed to happen. Now, there's of course another extreme, the opposite extreme in terms of Judaic leadership that can be a problem and is really more often the problem that we have today, which is you can also have leaders who say, I don't live in some fantasy world up in heaven. I live here in the real world. And here in the real world, there's no one here to save us except ourselves. And so we need to be strong. We need to have an economy. We need to have alliances with foreign powers that worship other gods. We need to have fancy weaponry. And even with all of that, we can't take certain kinds of risks because there's only, one time that we get to lose, and then we've lost forever. And there's this failure to believe that at the end of the day, this is up to Hashem. There's this failure to recognize that we are Hashem's eternal people and that He ultimately cares about how we show Him that we're willing to serve Him according to His Torah, and that it's not this terrifying chess game against chaos where if you make one wrong move, then it's all over, which much more so is, let's say, how Bibi Netanyahu seems to view his role, right? That I think as much as one can attribute good intention to him wanting some notion of what's best for Bnei Israel, it's a what's best that does not see the hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the events of history. And so it's a what's best that says, look, if it could be the case that this country could be destroyed by a nuclear attack from Iran, then we should sacrifice everything and anything in order to prevent that. And that means maybe we should give up sovereignty here and there, and maybe we should kowtow to the Americans about this and that, and all these things that we need in order to prevent game over coming from Iran, right? Whereas a leader a bit more in the direction of Moshe would say, well, look, the point is not that Hashem says, don't rely on me and my niflaot ever. The point is that Hashem says, you should be makadish that. You should set it aside for a special purpose, right? And that is mostly going to mean that you're going to live in the real world because He mostly wants you to go as far as you can, like David HaMelech, and say, Erdof oivayim wasigim, right? I will pursue my enemy and catch up to him, and be responsible for bringing about the result that you want. And then you go as far as you can in that direction, doing what you can and what you're capable of. But then when the point is you reach a certain impasse, and then you say, okay, the objective that serving Hashem has set for me is in that direction. I've come as far as I can go without wonders, and I have two choices now. I could go in a different direction away from what Hashem wants, and I could do that with my means that seem available and at my disposal, or I could forge ahead and try to go in the direction that I think Hashem wants, beyond the realm of what seems possible, and I can rely on Him to make up the difference. And clearly, now, the bigger problem we often have in Medinat Yisrael in the present era is we have a dearth of leaders who are willing to operate that way, to say, look, it's our job to go as far as we can with the rational means, the scientific means, the material means, the normal everyday world means, those means that allow us to thrive and flourish in the land that Hashem gave us the way He wants, so that we're not living in some kind of terrifying, otherworldly stasis in the midbar. But once we do that, once we go that distance, and we haven't made it all the way there because we still haven't managed to figure out how to solve the puzzle that way with regard to a whole host of things, like settling the land and conquering it, or building a temple, or whatever else, we don't just say, okay, so give up on those things. Let's just form a better fortified city-state in Tel Aviv with a small, smart army and wait for the end of the universe and for the sun to burn out. Instead, what we're supposed to say is, no, Hashem made the world. The purpose of His making the world was for us to do some of these things. Right now, it seems like we can't do them without bringing the whole roof down on our heads, but we're going to try to do them anyway because there's no choice otherwise, right? There's no there's no actual success in turning away from what Borei Olam wants you to do. So, on the one hand, Moshe was inappropriate as a leader for the land of Israel itself because he was, in a way, characteristic of his personality and his purpose. He was a bit deaf to what the people were really asking of him when they were saying, we want, sweet pomegranates and things. What they really wanted was to go to the land because they were fed up, not with trusting in Hashem, but they were fed up with the non-existence or the sort of bizarro existence of life in the Midbar. And they were ready for the reality that HaKadosh Baruch Hu actually wants his people to bring his presence into, with the temple and everything else that the Torah commands. So on the one hand, Moshe did make a mistake that showed his inappropriateness to lead the people into the land. And on the other hand, we need aspects of that, right? Yehoshua bin Nun was not the same thing as an alternative to Moshe as Bibi Netanyahu. Yehoshua bin Nun was a lot like Moshe. He was Moshe's student, and he still relied on the walls of Jericho to fall down, and not, he wasn't cutting a deal with the king of Babylon or of Egypt to give him a bigger army to try to conquer Jericho, right? So we do need leaders who have that element of trust in Hashem, where they're willing to say, look, if the only way we can go further is by walking into the sea, then the sea will split for us, right? We need leaders who will say that, but we also, at the same time, need them to walk us to the sea with that rooted practical understanding that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to work as hard as we can to figure out every part of it that we can do for ourselves and do those things first before he has to step in.